Hey everybody, what is up? It's the Tominator, and yeah, whew, I tell you, it took me quite a while to get up the nerve to make this video. I had this idea sort of sitting on the back burner for months, and even though I'm sure it's going to receive a ton of backlash, I gotta go with my heart and just put it out there, man, because I feel somebody needs to say it. And I know a bunch of you are probably pretty triggered right now after reading the title, like, how dare you even suggest Arnold was overrated? Of course he's the greatest of all time, you clueless hater. But before you tell me to talk to the hand or start furiously mashing the keyboard in unbridled outrage, give me a chance to explain, alright? Because in this video, I'm going to present several substantial reasons why I think Arnold should not be considered the greatest of all time, okay? So let's get into it. First and foremost, and let's just be clear on this, overrated does not mean bad. Not at all. I mean, you can be an absolute legend and nonetheless be overrated. An analogy for any of the hip-hop heads out there is that you could make an argument, and I would, that Biggie Smalls, aka the Notorious B.I.G., was overrated. Sure, don't get me wrong, he was undoubtedly one of the most talented MCs of all time, but many people would immediately put him in the top 5 or even top 3, and I just don't think that that's justified considering the dude only released 2 albums before he died. I mean, a lot of people can drop 2 fire albums. Just look at 50 Cent or The Game. Imagine if either one of those brothers had been shot and killed after they released their second album. They would have been immortalized right there on the spot, alongside Pac and Biggie. But since they lived and kind of fell off to a large extent, not too many people would consider them in that discussion anymore. But anyway, I digress. That little example was just meant to illustrate the point that you can be considered one of the greatest at what you do and still be overrated. But we're talking about bodybuilding here, and more specifically, the one and only Arnold Schwarzenegger, and the reasons why I consider him to be overrated. But in fact, I would go so far as to say that he is probably the most overrated bodybuilder ever, in the sense that so many people consider him the undisputed greatest of all time and act like he's untouchable. No one else in bodybuilding history is revered quite to this extent. Now, unlike the aforementioned Notorious B.I.G., Arnold's problem was not his lack of longevity. He competed professionally for over a decade and won the Olympia 7 times. So even though he did exit the game prematurely in his early 30s, at a time when most bodybuilders today are just getting warmed up, you still can't exactly fault him for having a short career. But what I would call into question is the nature and quality of his victories. Sure, he was Mr. Olympia 7 times, demolishing the previous record of 3 set by his predecessor and nemesis, Sergio Oliva. But you have to remember, the depth of his competition back then was nothing compared to what it is today. People like to write off Bill Heath's accomplishments, claiming that he competes in a weak era and only continues to win because his competition is so lackluster. But those same people, if any of you are Arnold fans, better go back and take a look at the lineups Arnold was headlining. I think you'll find that compared to Phil, he had a friggin' cakewalk. Case in point, most years he only had to fend off 3 or 4 guys tops because only a handful would even compete at the event back then. So by sheer numbers alone, he had a huge advantage over any modern-day bodybuilder who has to best over a dozen other finely tuned athletes. So the odds of winning were already several times greater than what Phil or Jay or Ronnie or Dorian or Haney had to face. So let's revisit all of his victories, shall we? Starting in 1970 when Arnold claimed his very first Olympia title. The only other guys in the lineup that year were Sergio Oliva and Reg Lewis. And I don't know about you, but I've never even heard of Reg Lewis, so judging by this pic right here, he wasn't much of a threat either. So basically, Arnold only had to overcome Sergio, which is admittedly no easy feat, considering we're talking about quite possibly the most genetically gifted freak of nature the sport had ever seen. But keep in mind that Sergio never had Arnold's work ethic. He wasn't as disciplined with his diet or his posing, and so he could never match the level of polish and presentation that Arnold brought. Then in 1971, Arnold faced a slightly steeper level of competition that included the likes of Roy Callender, Franco Columbu, and a returning Sergio Oliva. Or did he? Well, not really, because it turns out everybody except the Oak was disqualified for competing in rival organizations, giving Arnold an unopposed victory. Now, he probably would have won regardless, let's be honest, but it's hollow victories like this that nobody ever seems to bring up when it comes to Arnold. Should this really be counted towards his total of 7 Sandows when it was an automatic, uncontested win? Personally, I think we need to at least put an asterisk next to this one given the circumstances. Moving on to 1972, the lineup was as deep as it had ever been. With Sergio Oliva, Serge Nubret, Frank Zane, and Franco Columbu. But even here, Arnold allegedly only won by the vote of a single judge. 4 voted for him, but 3 had Oliva in first. It was definitely close, and once again, Arnold had better definition and presentation, whereas Sergio was bigger with better legs. To this day, many people still believe Sergio should have won the show. Now, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here, because I'm going off secondhand sources. I wasn't able to find an exact direct quote, but I believe Arnold himself said something along the lines that he wouldn't have had a problem had Oliva taken it that day. The IFBB and Joe Weider, perhaps sensing that their latest poster boy was in danger of being dethroned, banned Oliva from the 1973 Mr. O on the grounds that he had competed in an unsanctioned event at another bodybuilding organization. So this time, Arnold only had to go through his friend Franco Columbu and France's Serge Nubret. Now, really, come on. Arnold was 6'1" to 6'2", and Franco was nearly a full foot shorter at around 5'4", 5'5" at most. So Franco might have been built thick as a brick with some incredible low lats, but what hope did he really have when he's being literally dwarfed out there? That'd be like putting one of the 212 guys today against Big Ramy. It's just not going to happen when you're giving up that much size. And Serge Nubret, as graceful and aesthetic as he was, again, just didn't have the raw mass and detailed definition that Arnold did. So chalk up another easy W for the Oak. Now, 1974 was a legitimately superb year for Arnold. He was at his most massive and probably his best overall shape here. But again, he only had to fend off 3 other bodybuilders, Lou Ferrigno, Franco Columbu, and Frank Zane. All big names to be sure, but still, not exactly a deep lineup given the small number of competitors. I think you guys get the point by now, but since we're almost there, we might as well finish this thing off. In 1975, which is where footage from the movie Pumping Iron is taken from, you can see Arnold competing against Serge Nubret and Lou Ferrigno again in the heavyweight class. And to no one's surprise, he prevailed here, and then went on to best the winner of the under 200 class, Franco Columbu, yet again. Finally, we come to 1980, a highly controversial decision where Arnold clinched his 7th and final Olympia title. On the plus side, this was the first time he actually had to compete against a full lineup, consisting of 15 other bodybuilders and some big names such as Mike Mentzer, Tom Platz, Frank Zane, Samir Banu, Boyer Coe, Chris Dickerson, and Danny Padilla. However, on the negative side, this was also arguably the biggest screwjob in bodybuilding history, with most experts and fans alike maintaining that Arnold wholeheartedly did not deserve this one. So really, of his 7 Mr. Olympia victories, how many did he truly earn? I'm not suggesting he didn't deserve his wins, except in the case of 1980, but he was hardly competing against stacked lineups like what Dorian Yates or Ronnie Coleman had to deal with. So his level of competition, or lack thereof, calls into question the impressiveness of his reign. While it's true that Arnold likely could have continued to rack up many more titles had he not ventured off into Hollywood, at least 3 or 4, and possibly up to 6 more Sandows by my own admission, the fact of the matter is, he didn't. We can theorize and speculate all we want, but at the end of the day, Arnold made his decision to leave bodybuilding behind. And obviously, it turned out just fine for him, so who can blame him? But it did leave the door wide open for several future champions to eventually surpass him. Lee Haney and Ronnie Coleman both collected 1 more Sandow than Arnold with 8 apiece, and Phil Heath is now poised to do the same in 2018. That right there is a telling point. The fact that not 1, but 2, and probably soon to be 3, bodybuilders won more Mr. Olympias than him, and yet Arnold is still widely considered to be the best there ever was? I ask, why? After reviewing his astonishingly shallow victories, 2 of which he either didn't earn, as in the case of 1971 when the rest of the field was eliminated by disqualification, or didn't deserve, as in the case of 1980, why should we crown him the greatest bodybuilder to ever live? Now, many people will point out the obvious here, and that is the matter of his legacy. No one else has ever had the immense and life-changing impact that Arnold did. Nobody has ever attracted more people to the sport or done more to increase its popularity. This is an undeniable fact, and I could not agree more, that when it comes to influence and enduring legacy, Arnold is the undisputed king. I mean, he's just miles ahead of anybody else. The next biggest names in terms of impact would probably be guys like Dorian Yates and Ronnie Coleman, Lee Haney, Kai Green perhaps. None of these names can even hold a candle next to Arnold. I'll freely grant you that. So in this regard, Arnold was unquestionably the best there ever was, or ever will be. But is legacy alone enough to solidify yourself as the best ever? What about the physique itself? I'm sure many of you will claim that Arnold reigns supreme here as well, After all, his physique was timeless, a peerless icon of the golden era and one of the shining pinnacles of the classic aesthetic ideal. Arnold possessed a magnificent physique, no doubt, and he was truly ahead of his time, which is why nobody, aside from the myth Sergio Oliva, seriously challenged him during his run in the 70s. But compared to some of the guys who would come along later, in the 90s, for instance, come on. Are you seriously going to sit there and tell me that Arnold is more aesthetic or better developed than a 1993 Flex Wheeler or a 1994 Sean Ray? Do you think for even a moment that he had the granite hard conditioning and muscularity to hang with a 1993 Dorian Yates or a 1999 Ronnie Coleman? Any one of these guys would completely mop the floor with any version of Schwarzenegger if you could somehow stand them side by side for the judges. It would be absolutely no contest, trust me. And true, bodybuilding is subjective and some people will always prefer Arnold's look no matter what, but the judges still have a process. They still have a set of criteria to follow, and based on that criteria, there's just no way Arnold could hope to stand up to these more modern bodybuilders. It's called progression, folks. Just as cars get faster and more powerful over time, so too do athletes, except in this case, rather than faster, we're talking bigger and more shredded. Arnold and other bodybuilders back in the golden era simply didn't have the same kind of drugs at their disposal, let alone all the supplements and advanced equipment, so no, it's not even a fair fight. But who said it had to be? And for anybody saying that Arnold could have brought up his weak points and become just as big and shredded as Ronnie or Dorian had he competed in that era, for anybody claiming he could have improved his legs and back to match the likes of 80s champions like Benu and Haney, that's purely hypothetical, okay? We don't know that. We don't know that Arnold's body would have reacted as favorably to all these newer advanced hormones and chemicals as, say, Kevin Levroni's, who is renowned for his explosive responsiveness to gear. So that's pure conjecture, and it's ultimately just wishful thinking. The fact of the matter is that even if you prefer Arnold over these more massive modern bodybuilders, he would stand no chance to them on stage whatsoever. So like it or not, Arnold's physique today wouldn't even qualify for the Olympia, let alone crack top 10. Even people who don't care for that and who feel disillusioned with the official judging process and the direction that bodybuilding has gone, for those who praise Arnold for his classic proportions and aesthetic appeal, why does it always have to be Arnold? What about the other aesthetic bodybuilders throughout the ages like Serge Nubret, Robbie Robinson, Frank Zane, Bob Paris, Thierry Pastel, Frances Benfato, etc., etc.? The list goes on and on. What is it about Arnold that people find so special? Personally, I think it comes down to a couple of simple factors. Number one, and this might sound like an excuse, but it really is the elephant in the room and the key to Arnold's unparalleled popularity, and that is his movie star status. When Arnold broke into Hollywood in roles like Conan the Barbarian and Terminator, he became a household name instantly, and at that moment, he transcended bodybuilding for good. I think it's largely his exposure through popular film and his undeniable charisma that really wins him the majority of his fans, more than anything. I mean, think about it. If Arnold had been the one to remain behind as some obscure bodybuilding champion and someone like Sergio Oliva or Frank Zane had gone on to become a blockbuster actor in his stead, who do you think would be more popular today? So people who don't know shit about bodybuilding will automatically tend to gravitate towards Arnold simply because he's an A-list celebrity, easily the most famous and recognizable bodybuilder in history. So he's kind of like a gateway into bodybuilding for a lot of people. And once you're exposed to a new field or industry like this, whatever originally introduced you into that world will tend to hold a special place in your heart. It's like what Lord of the Rings is to fantasy, right? Because the Lord of the Rings is essentially the father of epic fantasy, and despite being built upon and outdone in many ways by other more recent works like George R. R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, aka Game of Thrones, and potentially a number of other sprawling series as well, many fans will stubbornly cling to the notion that The Lord of the Rings is unequaled and always will be, simply because that was their first great fantasy experience, and they happened to read it at an impressionably young age. I would argue that the majority of fans who claim Arnold is the best bodybuilder ever are, and not always, but more often than not, akin to that avid Lord of the Rings fan who refuses to acknowledge advancement, and would rather idolize their first love through rose-tinted glasses. And adding to Arnold's legendary aura is the plethora of photoshoot pictures you can find all over the internet. Probably no other bodybuilder in history has a wider array of flattering modeling photos than Arnold. And what I mean by this is that if you Google Arnold bodybuilding or Arnold posing or anything like that, you'll find that very few of his pictures are taken from actual competition, probably only 10% or so. The rest depict him standing around on a beach or a mountainside or posing in the gym like this when he's swole and pumped to the brim. I'll tell you what, anybody can be made to look amazing during photo shoots or training under the right lights. See how Dennis James looks better than Mr. Olympia Ronnie Coleman when they pose together in the gym? For the professional bodybuilder, it's contest day that really counts. That's where they put their money where their mouth is, and that's where they make a name for themselves. Unfortunately, when you compare Arnold's contest photos to his non-contest photos, he begins to look much less mythical and awe-inspiring and more, well, ordinary or even underwhelming. So that's a big part of it, I think. We're being bombarded with the most flattering imagery of Arnold everywhere we look, because his modeling career was so prolific, it completely overshadows his actual competitive career. So we're used to seeing him at his absolute best. Whereas in this day and age of social media, every single moment one of these guys takes so much as a breath, people are snapping an unflattering pic and lampooning them for having a bubble gut. It's the complete opposite of how it was back in Arnold's day, where the media and photographers were working with him to present him in the best possible light in order to sell magazines. Whereas nowadays, people are working actively against the champ to defame him for cheap YouTube views. One more reason I think people are so awestruck by Arnold's physique is, of course, because he did have that truly Herculean look many of us aspire towards. And his best muscle groups happen to be the show muscles we all crave, namely the biceps and the pecs. I mean, what guy doesn't go to the gym trying to develop a nice thick chest and bulging biceps? Along with the triceps and shoulders, these are by far the most popular muscle groups for men to train. I mean, who cares about having big legs or a massive cobra back? That's not going to get you the bitches. Leave that stuff to the hardcore lifters. Now, I'm not saying most people don't train back or legs. I think that most of us today are well informed and dedicated enough to train the entire body. But let's put it this way. If it comes down to skipping arms or legs, let's be real, nobody's going to go with leg day, unless maybe your idol is Tom Platz. So anyway, to get back to the point, biceps and pecs are easily two of Arnold's greatest strengths, and so I think that despite him having a notoriously undersized set of legs, a lot of people are willing to overlook that flaw because most guys don't care to have tree trunks for thighs. But we all want bigger arms. Arnold also knew how to present his body to the fullest, I'll give him that. He was an expert at hiding his weaknesses while showcasing his strong points. For example, he would often twist his torso in poses such as this to minimize his waistline, which was relatively wide for the time at 34 inches. He fully admits this, by the way, so this isn't just me blasting him or making stuff up to make him look bad. He'd also hit a lot of poses with outstretched arms to highlight his massive peaked biceps, or puff up his ribcage for those side chest shots to make his pecs look larger than life. So he was a masterful poser, this is true. But again, so are many other bodybuilders who don't get even a quarter of the credit that Arnold does. How about Ed Corney here, or Lee Labrada, Sean Ray, Melvin Anthony? Go watch these men pose and tell me who is the better poser. Each of these guys I just named were just as good, if not outright better, than Arnold when it comes to the art of posing. And this is basically my point and the real crux of the argument here. So look, Arnold was definitely one of the greatest. I'm sure no matter how many times I repeat that, some of you will continue to think I'm just straight hating on him. But in fact, when you factor in the legacy and the long-lasting impact he's had, you could certainly make a legitimate case for him being the best ever. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with informed fans of bodybuilding having that opinion. What I do have a problem with is comments like this I see all over YouTube of people claiming he's the best without providing any justification whatsoever. And this is just from my own channel in the last, 2 months or something. I cherry-picked some, so this is just my own videos. And it, to me, just reeks of blatant, naive fanboyism, and I personally find it very annoying. And that's why I decided to make this video, even though I know I'm going to get flamed for it, because somebody needed to. Most bodybuilding enthusiasts, even experts within the industry, seem to place Arnold on a pedestal as if he were a god above our lowly mortal judgment. But in reality, as great as he was, I think he can't help but be somewhat overhyped and overrated, considering he didn't really do anything the best other than the way he influenced and grew the sport, which, as I already alluded to, was largely the result of his movie star celebrity status. So to recap, his 7 Olympia wins really weren't all that impressive when you factor in his limited level of competition and the fact that at least 2 bodybuilders have already attained more Sandows than him. His physique itself wasn't the greatest if you look at it objectively and not relatively based on era. His posing, excellent as it was, wasn't quite on the same level as some of the other masters of presentation. So this is why I don't think Arnold should automatically be considered the GOAT. It's just not decisive enough when you really break it down. Now, you're free to form your own opinion, and it's fine if you disagree and maintain that Arnold was the best, but I'm just explaining why I personally don't agree with that assertion, and why I'm sick of people treating Arnold as if he's this infallible perfect deity that nobody could ever come close to. In my opinion, he's already been surpassed by at least one other bodybuilder when you take into account all of these various elements we touched upon, and that man, as I already mentioned in my top 10 bodybuilders video, is none other than the 8-time king, Ronnie Coleman. Lee Haney, for that matter, I think warrants a serious argument. It really disgusts me, quite frankly, at how frequently Haney is overlooked whenever discussions of the GOAT arise, given that he also surpassed Arnold's Olympia record. Even Dorian Yates, given how dominant he was in such a stacked era, his 6 Sandows count for a lot more in my estimation than Arnold's 7, that's for sure. And I think if Phil Heath manages to reach his goal of 10, hell, even if he makes it to 8 or 9, he too will probably eclipse him as well. So that's all for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. Hopefully I didn't piss too many of you off, but I guess we'll see how that like bar fares. If anything has the potential to unseat my Why Big Ramy Will Never Become Mr. Olympia video, with a worse dislike ratio, this is it. But please keep in mind, I didn't do this to troll or insult. It wasn't meant to be a rant. I did my research and, believe it or not, chose my words very carefully when piecing together this script, so hopefully it didn't come across like biased hating. The reason I did this was to, hopefully, educate and make a case for why I think that Arnold, despite all of his success and incomparable legacy, is ultimately overrated as a bodybuilder. Until next time, homies.